Yeah, you don't have to applaud every time. It's not compulsory. Is everyone actually back from the groups? I suppose some have fallen by the wayside and found that they were really in their beds. But that's excusable at this time. So thank you all for persisting. I think people are still sitting down. I know that the discussion after the last session was incomplete, and we may want to go back to those sorts of questions as well as some of the ones that may be raised by this one. So we'll see how it goes. We've got a little bit of leeway, Father Casey, haven't we? Has he introduced me and gone? Yes. We've got a little bit of leeway. Evensong is 4:30, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
But there's a break in between. Yeah. Okay, well, I'll be sensitive to your needs. Some time ago, there was a general election in England, and some of us decided that because of the issues that the nation was facing and Christians were facing, that it would be a good idea to have various meetings around the country of Christians with those who were standing for election. No doubt you do similar things here. The meetings were really quite excellent because very often the candidates had never met Christians in such force before. We had a meeting, for instance, at Durham University, where we had to change the venue because so many students turned up. And these parliamentary candidates had never seen 500 Christian students all at once. I mean, it's quite a thing to see. However, many leaders, pastors, clergy of large evangelical churches, both Anglican and others, said to us at the time, they said, "Oh, well, bless you, you go and do these things. It's great you're doing this, but it's not our calling. Our calling is to make new Christians and to nurture them in the faith, and we'll pray for you." Now, this is certainly in Britain quite a common phenomenon. It's a way of opting out of involvement with society, with the community, with political, social, economic issues. And this raised for me the question in a very sharp way at the time, why should Christians be involved in public life? What is the basis for that involvement? Now, you will keep in mind, of course, what I said earlier on about culture, because that underlies everything else that we would want to say. But this is a more specific question, if you like. And the answer actually lies in the truth that the Bible teaches and Christians believe that human beings have been community from the very beginning. You see, there's no such thing as merely an individual. It is true, as Larry Seidentop's work has shown, that Christian faith has given importance to the person. Bishop Ray Sutton was saying very much the same thing yesterday. But persons, of course, become persons by being in relationship. And with the Bible, what do you have? You have community from the beginning. He created them male and female, ordered them one towards the other, gave them a common mission, common tasks, which they were to fulfill together, but each in his or her own way. I mean, that is a sort of a statement of a Christian anthropology which should be up somewhere on the walls of every church, because getting confused about any of those things leads to all sorts of errors in the life of the church, as you and I know. So we have community from the beginning. Community and being involved in community for Christians is not an option. In this sense, Christians are not and cannot be social contractarians. You see, it's not as if individuals, whether the noble savage of Rousseau or the brutal savage of Hobbes, to protect themselves entered into some kind of social contract, thus creating communities and nations and societies. That is not a Christian view. God's purpose is for us to be social animals from the very beginning. And then, of course, we have in the Bible something that runs throughout the Bible, the choice of a people. The choice of a people. Of course, there are individuals of great note within that choice. Abraham, the patriarchs, Moses, the holy matrons, as they were called in the old marriage service, the prophets and prophetesses, and all sorts of people. But the choice is of Israel. And I've always been fascinated by this. Why Israel? Ronald Knox's doggerel thing about how odd of God to choose the Jews, but odder still of those who choose a Jewish God but spurn the Jews. Why? Here is a group of nomadic tribes wandering around the Middle East. The very word from which Hebrew is derived, apiru, was a kind of insult. Because they were regarded as degraded, they could be enslaved, as indeed they were. And yet God chose them, not because there were many, not because they were great, but because He chose them. The question of divine election, of a people, that's for us, for the time being, the important point. The election of a people. And not only did He choose them, but by divine providence and by divine overruling both, various things come to the fore which are important for our involvement in society today. So, the monarchy, for example, came into existence almost as a rebellious act against God. And yet God's overruling used the monarchy for the good of the people, and indeed, eventually, for the coming of the Messiah Himself. And although the monarchy came into being, it was not like the monarchies all around in the Middle East at that time, or in some cases even today. So if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 17, or what Samuel said both to Saul and to David, you will see how the idea of a constitutional monarchy emerges, of a king who is himself under the law, under God's law. A priesthood is provided for this people, for their spiritual needs. But there is no confusion between monarchy and priesthood. Prince and priest are separate. Temple and palace are different. Now this is very important because, for instance, in Islamic polity, there is no difference. There is no difference between church and state, between religion and government. And so many of the problems that we are facing in our world today is because of that. And then, of course, there are the prophets who stand over against both polity and cult, who can, from time to time, speak out against the king, and from time to time against the cult of ritual sacrifice and worship when it is misused or abused. So the choice of a people who are then provided for in these different ways, all of that remains significant for us today. But the responsibility of God's people for society is not limited to their own society. So what happens when they're taken into exile? Well, like so many refugees, exiles, they are bitter about what has happened to them. And you know the psalm, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And what did God say? Did he say, don't sing it then? No, what did he say? Jeremiah 29, when you go to the city in which you are to be exiled, you are to plant gardens and eat the produce of them. You are to marry and to give in marriage. You are to have children. You are to prosper. And you are to pray and to work for the welfare of the city. Not your own city. This is not about Zion. This is not about the towns and villages of the land. This is about a place where they have forcibly been taken into exile. The book of Daniel shows us how Daniel and his companions both are involved in the society in which they have been placed and maintain a distinctive attitude towards it. So they do not participate in everything in that society, and when the time comes, when they're asked to do something that is contrary to God's purpose, they can say no, and do say no. Again, God's purposes are not limited to Israel. I mean, Israel is the pattern of God's saving history. But already, in the book of Amos, for example, God says to Israel, just as I brought you out of Egypt, so have I been working with the Syrians and the Philistines and the Ethiopians. Those who are traditional enemies of Israel and those who are furthest away. In Isaiah 19, there is a great vision about God's purpose for the whole region. And the vision ends with what? Blessed be Egypt, my people. Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my heritage. Blessed be Egypt, my people. I find that Christian Egyptians and sometimes even Muslim Egyptians are moved to tears when they're told this is in the Bible. You see. So God's purposes for salvation, patterned after his work in Israel, but also his judgment. So the nations can be judged just as Judah and Israel can be judged. God is judge of all. He is not just limited like the other gods, the ethnic gods of the peoples round about, to concern for his own people, his own group. That is very significant for us, that the Bible is the story of a people and how God is working his purposes out among that people. So Jesus' teaching then to give to God what is God's and to Caesar what is Caesar's has to be seen in the light of this development of Israel. Temple is not to be confused with palace, king with priest. To give to God what is God's and to Caesar what is Caesar's. That is to say, there are things that are legitimate of the political order to ask for us, to ask of us. and there are things that are God's that we have to render to Him. This is of the first importance in any kind of engagement, Christian engagement with society, whatever model we develop for that engagement, and in the course of Christian history there have been many such. Not to be confused, but to be involved, if you like. And so St. Paul's teaching of the godly magistrate, I think it was Bishop Ray who was saying yesterday that the church has not been given the sword, the godly ruler has been given the sword. Why? To reward the good and to punish the evil. Both St. Paul in the letter to the Romans and 1 Peter says that the task of the godly ruler is to reward what is good, what has been done that is good, and to punish what has been evil, what is for the destruction of society, what is not for the common good, and so on. And indeed, this is how we find Christians engaged in the early period of the church's life, as I think I hinted at last time, that in this discipline of the sociology of the New Testament, we find that Christians are to be found in this early period in the most disreputable parts of the cities, for instance. What are they doing there? They are saving female children who have been exposed and left to die. Well, you may think that's not happening today, but something very like it is happening these days. We had an article published in a British medical journal last year called Post-Birth Abortion. You know, what is post-birth abortion? Yeah. So we shouldn't be complacent that these things are not happening. They were saving women who had fallen into prostitution. They were burying paupers who had not anyone else to bury them. And most of all, they were manumitting slaves. Let no one tell you that the Christian church did not realize the wrongness of slavery until Wilberforce came along. It's wonderful that Wilberforce came along, but the church knew, the early church was buying the freedom of slaves to such an extent that when Constantine became, well, whatever he became, I think Bishop Ray is more sanguine about it than I am. He realized what was going on, and so he gave bishops the power that the magistrates used to have to manumit slaves. That's how bishops ended up being magistrates. Not a desirable development, but it led to them wearing purple, among other things, because they had become royal officials. And not only then, but Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, at the Synod of Westminster, declared in his time that anyone who engaged in slavery in Britain would be excommunicated. So, the credibility of Christians in those days was enhanced by this kind of involvement, and many sociologists now say these are some of the reasons why the churches grew so rapidly, because of this kind of involvement. At the time of the Reformation, there were, of course, well, at least two views about how there should be involvement with the political order. One was, of course, the line taken by the so-called Magisterial Reformation, and that was that the Church should have an acknowledged place in the councils of state. Let's put it like that. In England, this was called establishment. There were other models that were tried elsewhere. It was a model that brought the voice of the Church to the affairs of state in an immediate way. People ask me about the establishment of the Church of England, and sometimes that the answer that I've given is that if the state wants to hear the voice of the Church in its councils, why should the Church refuse, provided it is without compromise? Now, of course, that is the big question, without compromise. Can it be without compromise? Has it been without compromise? The answer is, well, no, it has very often resulted in compromise. So, when Henry VIII, who was a great bully, really, threatened the convocations of the Church of England, the bishops and the clergy, with huge fines and imprisonment if they did not at once subscribe to the royal supremacy. What did the convocations do? I mean, I'm afraid they were not marked by their courage. But even in this timorous and cowardly way, to escape fines and imprisonment, they said they accepted the royal supremacy insofar as the law of Christ allows. Well, Henry forgot the last bit very quickly, but actually that last tag is very important. Insofar as the law of Christ allows. This is also what John Fisher said to Henry when he demanded that Fisher should recognize the legitimacy of his children from Anne Boleyn. So, establishment, the presence of the Church in the affairs of the state can be beneficial if it is attended by this exception, insofar as the law of Christ allows. But of course, the radical Reformation, the Anabaptist tradition, for instance, had a different view of things, which was not to take part in the affairs of the state at all, but to be prophetic over and against it. That tradition has had tremendous influence in this country, and you will know more about that than I do. But the view was not that Christians should have nothing to do with the state, but that they should bring God's word to bear on their relations with the state, whilst not becoming compromised by its structures. So neither the Magisterial Reformation nor the Radical Reformation excuse Christians from having nothing to do with society and what was going on inside it. I mean, that's the point, I think, to understand. Of course, the fact is that the godly magistrate of Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 turns into the raving beast of Revelations 13. So how did that happen? And how often does it happen? And is it happening now? I mean, that's, a crucial question for Christians to ask. And where is it happening? In some situations, of course, there is a mixture where you have both elements of a godly magistrate and of the ravening beast seeking to devour Christians and the church. So what should our attitude be in the world as it is today. What can we say? What can we do? In the early church, again, as you know, the crime was simply being a Christian. Propter nomen. I mean, all the magistrate had to do was to ask, are you a Christian? And if you said yes, that was enough for condemnation. To escape it, on the other hand, all you had to do was to sign a little certificate called a libellus, which said, I, X, Y, have always sacrificed to the gods. And you could go home. Of course, we hear about the numbers of martyrs who didn't go home, but the number of libelli that have been found suggests that a lot of people did go home. You see. It's all they had to do. Some years ago, 2 young women were arrested in Iran for leading a house church. And they were put in the maximum security prison. I don't know if Samira is here. Is Samira here today? She was here yesterday. Anyway, they were put in, and from time to time they would be brought before a judge, an Islamic judge, who would only ask them, are you prepared to renounce your faith? And each time they gave the same answer. They said, the Holy Spirit has revealed to us that Jesus is the Messiah. How can we deny this? So they were taken back and forth, until God intervened and they were released. I understand that they are in this country at this time. Praise the Lord for that. So this is not just happening, in the 2nd or 3rd centuries. This is happening now in our world at this time. But what should we do when we are confronted with the beast rather than the godly magistrate? So when the ruler commands us to do something which God forbids, we have to say no. Respectfully, but clearly, no. We cannot go where you want to take us. This may have to do with respect for the human person. It may have to do with the institution of marriage. It may have to do with how we treat our fellow citizens. When the ruler commands what God forbids, or when the ruler forbids what God commands. So, God commands us to worship Him, and if the rulers try to prevent us from worshipping Him as they do regularly in Saudi Arabia, the Christians have to say, at the risk of imprisonment, deportation, whatever it may be, we must continue to worship. Mustn't we? And as fellow Christians, we have a duty to uphold them in this courageous witness, not to turn our faces away. I so admire your Center for International Religious Freedom in Washington, and they issue a report every year to the State Department and to the President, and it has much in it that is of great profit. But when it comes to the entry for Saudi Arabia, there is only one line. It says, the President of the United States has exercised his right of a waiver for this country. You see? Are you speaking to your congressman about this, or your senators, or whatever? I think you should be. So, when the ruler commands what God forbids, or when the ruler forbids what God commands, we have to say no to the ruler. That should be quite clear, whatever the consequences. Whatever the consequences. Now, somebody said yesterday that there are no martyrs in the United States. I can't imagine how that can be true. But it appears to me, and you're better judges of this than I am, that there will be martyrs. So will you be among those who sign the little certificate and go home safely, or will you take the other way, the narrow way that leads to life? Not in the eyes of the world, but in reality. The churches in the West have been for centuries now pastoral in their paradigm. That is how the ministry of the church, the life of the church, has understood it. And the evangelical metaphor for it, by evangelical meaning what is in the Gospels, is that of salt. Yeah? Salt is, in the nature of the case, invisible in its work. So, salt used to be, much more importantly, a preservative, to preserve food, before there were refrigerators. But working away invisibly. It provides taste, invisibly. If you see the salt on the food, there's arguably too much in the food or on the food. It is also a nutrient. I have a long-standing argument with my wife as to whether salt is a nutrient or not. I think it is. She thinks I eat too much of it. But it does all of this invisibly, doesn't it? And that has been the kind of way in which the churches in the West have often operated. Hatching, matching, dispatching, visiting, all of that. You know what I mean. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But the question is, should we change our view from one kind of evangelical metaphor of salt to another evangelical metaphor, which is that of light? See, that's a missionary metaphor, not a pastoral one. So now you are not just talking about the pastoral care of a believing population. You see? Maybe teaching them, bringing them on in the faith, looking after their spiritual and other needs and so on. Now you are talking about being distinctive communities, attracting people to yourselves by the witness of your faith, by your suffering maybe, by your worldview, in the absence of a worldview perhaps in the wider society, by giving people a reason for living, by giving people hope which is anchored in what God has done for you and for others. But if you change from the salt approach to the light metaphor, this is not going to be without pain. Clergy may have to be retrained. That's horror, isn't it? Clergy having to be retrained, my goodness, whatever next. They may have to forget many of the things that they've learned in the past. Maybe evangelists will become more important than pastors. That's another horror story, isn't it? What about the home? The use of the Christian home as light to the world. How is that going to happen? So, there's a lot of thinking and working to do if we are to change from the salt metaphor to the light. Whatever happens, we are not excused. If we take the Bible seriously, we are not excused. Involvement in the community, in the wider society, in the nation, and in the world. Because this is according to God's purposes. And whether it is of enhancing the common good, or whether it is resisting social evil, we have to play our part. That is what people in the Bible were doing, and that is what we may be called to do in our own situation, sometimes quite unexpectedly. Are we prepared for it? If we are not, what do we need to do to prepare for it? What steps do we need to take in the formation of clergy, for instance? In how we organize our church events, whether we do an audit on our congregations to see whether they really are clubs or not. And if they're not clubs, what are they? Are we just like-minded, look like one another and easy with that? Or are we going to take the painful route of going to people who are unlike us? Because that is what mission is about. So, brothers and sisters, that is what I had to say about the churches and our own as Christians' involvement in public life. I now look forward to your response. But as you respond, if you have anything that is left over from this morning, please do bring it up and we can discuss it. Thank you very much indeed.